session with MP Perkins for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. Mr. Kolarenko, I really want to get to questions for you because you're such an innovator, but I am going to, and I will come to you in perhaps the next round, maybe this round, but I'd like to begin with CanPay. In your opening statement, you talked about that your company has already done $100 billion cleared in transactions over 3 years. Can you tell me where that's been done and what kind of services you've offered?
Yeah, absolutely. We've built the blockchain technology, this team that formed CanPay, and this blockchain technology is licensed to multiple operators that work around the world. It mostly does transfers and does some settlement transactions in some cases.
The ability to offer some of these services as a Canadian-owned and innovative company around the world, but not here in Canada?
Not at this point in time.
Canada. Is that because we as consumers are given no choice when we operate with a Canadian bank? And I share Mr. Kodolenko's views on mutual funds. And thanks for doing all that advertising, by the way. But the banks own the clearing system and essentially have a complete monopoly power on e-transfers, interchange fees. Do they use that power to keep you out through their lobbying efforts in Ottawa or other means?
Not so. The key issue that we face once we want to offer a meaningful transfer solution is to be able to offer bank-to-bank movement of the funds. The way the system is set up right now, it's we cannot. Like, where would you go to get this access? First, if you go request it from the bank says Interac exists. And then if you want to make this meaningful for all Canadians, you need to go to every financial institution, or at least all the major ones, in order to get it. All of this brings more and more hurdles, and hurdles in our space is a lot of wasted time, and all of this it makes it defeats anybody coming forward to offer these meaningful solutions to the Canadians. On the back end of this, for the longest time, regulation is coming forward now as it comes to everything that comes to blockchain. But it's also all the licensing that comes with using this technology as a back end for the movement also carries challenges as it comes here.
When we all sign up for a transaction banking account, whenever we do it, generally people do it in Canada because it's where their parents banked or because it's close to where they live or work. I worked for a bank at one time, I do confess. I'm not given any choice of service providers. I get my little debit card with a little Interac signal on it. When you're seeing this around the world, are consumers given a choice of systems? Or how does that competitive system work? Or does that bank say, no, you have to use X provider?
Depending on the jurisdiction, so you'd have multiple. Depending on the jurisdiction, you have different flavors of how this is done. But there's frequently more than one way to move funds around, but this is not the case in Canada.
The lack of competition, the complete monopoly. We know, and we've heard here at the committee that for some reason, those who are on the board of Interac seem to have a much lower cost than those who are not on the board of Interac for some reason. I wonder if you could comment on that monopolistic practice, but also when that movement of money happens around the world, what are the kinds of things that people in other countries are getting access to in terms of services that we cannot get here, where we're sort of operating on a 1980s system?
100%. So on the specific price offering, as I mentioned in the letter, it's not public, so we don't know exactly who's being offered what. But as we've operated with some small businesses in the country, they pay different fees to make these transfers. They say it's volume priced or volume based. Just at the core of it being volume based, it disadvantages small and medium businesses in a sense. In other jurisdictions, What people get, and if to separate people from consumers, and the jurisdictions I mentioned, UK, Sweden, India, and Brazil, just to name a few, all e-transfers are free. So people moving money between their accounts is just at no cost. And then for small and medium businesses, depending on certain thresholds, it can be free or even much lower than what small businesses get offered here. And then interfacing with other modern features that are more or less becoming required today. Not everybody has done the bridge to blockchain. A lot of work is being done, especially that today is the age of the adoption in some of these countries. But just being able to connect multiple different systems. I'll mention UPI in this case, which is India. They even made it easier to bridge, paying for telecom services within these networks and leveraging that in order to move funds as well. So these are a lot of features and capabilities that are possible, and we're done. And this is public information. In under 3 years, in all of these cases, we don't have access to such features today in Canada.
Access to Canada, I don't know if you're going through a process to try and through the regulators to try and get approved to operate as a Canadian company in Canada. Seems a difficult thing to do. Will you be allowed to break into the transfer between banking systems, or are they limiting you to just providing services to fintechs?
So this is exactly where the major problem is for us and any other entity trying to offer these kind of fintech services. Real-time settlement, bank-to-bank settlement, there's no clear direction where to go or who do you go to get this. And you have to go to the banks one-on-one and then set up your own system in order to get something on there. So it's not really clear, especially with no open banking regulations established in the country. So this is the biggest challenge on that front.
Because I will take a moment, Mr. Kolodenko. Can you pronounce your name again?
Kolodenko.
Kolodenko, Mr. Kolodenko. So you've innovated in a very difficult space over 25 years to get in. How did you get into the system and around our burdensome issues and the bureaucratic, monopolistic control the banks have had over the trading type of platform that you do?
Well, thank you for your kind words. It hasn't been easy. We found a niche in the marketplace very early, where there were high fees and a lot of costs in between. And what we did in the very, very beginning, our mission is to help consumers become much more financially successful and secure. And so the way that we did it is that we having that as our North Star and looking at that, we cut out all the fees in the middle, and we went directly to the consumer using existing rules and regulations. And of course, we had to have a lot of discussions with the regulators. We have a lot of regulators that we deal with on a regular basis. We are heavily regulated in the financial services industry. And it's a lot of conversations to get them to understand that we're on the side of consumers. We need to help consumers do more, and competition is good and is better. And we were at the forefront of lowering fees and helping consumers do better. And that's
and what are some of the monopolistic practices that the banks control to try and keep you from eating their lunch and getting their customers? I'm sure they're still using tactics to try and limit your ability to succeed.
Well, the banks are in every facet of consumers' financial lives. And so they bundle products together, and they say, well, if you buy this, then we'll give you a discount on that. And so there's ways that they have, and just by sheer volume, the sheer mass that they have, they're able to have lower costs and make more profits. Whereas us, as a firm that is much lower in terms of scale, we don't have the same type of scale, and so therefore our costs are higher. It's much more difficult to compete.
Thank you very much, MP Perkins. We'll now turn it over to MP Van Bynen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And like Mr. Perkins, if we're admitting our sins, I too had a career in banking, and a part of that was financial advice as well. The Competition Bureau recently announced at our committee that they're looking into potential anti-competitive behavior in the e-transfer system. So I'll start with Mr. Abudaya. Would you have any suggestions for the Bureau that they should look into as they're undertaking this investigation?
And absolutely, as I mentioned in the note, and the recommendations are, to enable competition is to look at the hurdles that stop companies like us from offering competitive solution in the market. And, definitely assessing how easy it is to access the accounts. Just looking at what the Consumer Bureau in the US did is, they looked at how can a company, and with the right regulations, that's regulated with the right bodies within the country, how can they get access to this information, and how difficult it is to get access to this information, and to be able to move the funds from one account to the other. This is definitely one of the aspects to look at. And if looking at how other people did it as well usually helps. So looking at the examples in other countries where they opened the competition for, or they opened this floor for competition, and that definitely always improved consumer lives, is definitely the other venue that we could look at.
Comments, Mr. Kolodenko, from your perspective? What should the Competition Bureau look into?
Yeah, well, I think the Competition Bureau should look into the overall transparency, make sure that there's clear language and simplified disclosures. Certainly, we recommend that the committee propose a competition to the review, competition review framework in its entirety, and an accompanying schedules for review of all new and existing payments frameworks and intermediaries as well, and a review of chosen dominant ecosystem intermediaries.
So has Questrade observed any exclusive agreements or practices by major financial institutions that limit access to or functionality of e-transfer systems for non-bank entities?
It's impossible to get into, well, it's very difficult to get into the Interact system to become a direct transfer payments provider. And the costs associated with that are burdensome.
Are there any technical or operational restrictions imposed by payment providers that hinder innovation or the ability of companies like Questrade to compete effectively? So I'm looking at restrictions imposed by payment providers.
Well, when you're saying payment providers, do you mean Interact itself, or are you talking about intermediaries that connect into Interact? There's several.
Interact and/or the bank, the financial institutions.
Interact has a very strict framework for connecting into it, and they'll only allow you to do things on their specific terms and in ways that they want you to do. It's very, very difficult to work with them.
So what recommendations would you propose to ensure that there's fair competition and better consumer outcomes in the e-transfer payments market?
I think we have two choices. Either we create an alternative to Interact that functions as a utility for the entire industry with regulated payments, and in a framework where they need to open it up to others to be able to tap into. It has to be regulated, and the biggest thing is fraud. Of course, you have to monitor fraud. And the other one is to do that with Interact and to make sure that they're allowing others in to review how their fee schedule is structured, similar to a stock exchange, if you will. A stock exchange is a public utility. The fees are regulated by the Ontario Securities Commission, and they have to allow access to regulated entities to be able to do what they need to do in order to interact with consumers.
In banking system, their primary brand is the confidence and the security. Are there any processes or systems that you'd recommend that the Competition Bureau look into to give that same sense of security within the systems regarding e-transfers?
Certainly, the payment provider needs to be involved in fraud detection. It is a very serious issue that affects not only the institutions that are responsible for transferring money, but also consumers themselves. And so there are systems that are being implemented throughout the world that need to be looked at and implemented.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions.
Thank you, MP Van Bynen. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay, you have the floor. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for your presentations today. My question will be for Mr. Jenkin of the Consumers Council of Canada. According to you, the institutions and financial stakeholders, do they invest sufficiently in education and information on financial literacy, in particular, for example, the cost resulting from the use of credit cards, which is not a means of payment that is the same as others. It's not the same as debit cards. It's not the same as paying in cash, or so it has high interest rates as well. So is there enough awareness building being done? Has there been enough investment in that? I would even call it prevention.
Thank you, Mr. Savard-Tremblay, for your question. The banks are not delinquent in providing information to their customers, but the question of how effective are the efforts, I think, is another matter. Our own observation of, we focused on credit cards, but it's more general. Financial literacy, broadly speaking, for consumers is a very important issue. It's a public interest issue, and it's one that government has to be engaged in as well. But unfortunately, a lot of the problems around financial literacy are that studies have been done which indicate that even with good financial literacy education, often because of biases that consumers have, the behavioral aspects that they exhibit when they are dealing with money in general and with financial institutions particularly, often work against their own interests. And so it's been found that financial literacy is not always as effective in and of itself as people hope it might be. That's why the regulatory backup is really important here, which is that there are protections in place that don't rely on the consumer being knowledgeable in a detailed way about how systems function and about risks involved. I mean, the reality is that to some degree consumers need to be protected from themselves often because of the fact that they may engage in practices instinctively that aren't necessarily good for them. So it's important to have a very clear, concise, and unified set of protections and rules about what can and can't be done when consumers engage in electronic payment systems in particular, which are, despite the lack of innovation in Canada, they are becoming more complex and they're growing in variety and number. And people are not as familiar with that as they are traditional payment instruments such as cash, to a certain extent debit cards, checks, and so forth. We need a unified set of consumer protections for all kinds of electronic transfers and payment mechanisms, not just the system now, which is it's piecemeal. Some cases, the protections that are available in one payment mechanism are not available in another, or the thresholds are different. So it's very important that we get a good understanding of what needs to be protected for consumers and make that available across all payment channels. Because if we don't do that, consumers have got a hope of understanding what are their rights and what do they have to be worried about.
Ceci dit, puis je suis pressé, vous avez dit les banques ne sont pas délinquantes.
Now, you said that banks are not delinquent, and
Je suis pas en mesure.
I'm not able as a person to, read their minds of banks, but banks live more off indebtedness than investment. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I am saying is that they have, to some extent, conflicting objectives, or at least conflicting interests. They don't want a lot of consumers getting seriously in debt and then not able to pay off their debts that they accumulate on credit cards or any other financial instrument for that matter. On the other hand, credit cards, because they have such abnormally high interest rates, are a very profitable product line for banks. And so having, I guess the perfect world for them might be that they have lots of indebtedness, but no one who's really going to the wall just yet. But that's not clearly in the interests of consumers. The problem with credit cards and perhaps newer payment mechanisms or credit mechanisms is that they're engaged in accumulating debt in a way that it's not structured in a way that gives them pause. That's why we've recommended in our paper that we need a much more proactive set of policies and processes where consumers who are running into financial difficulty or have payment histories or debt accumulation histories that are not that indicate that they may be in trouble at some point in the future, the bank should be intervening and helping those people get to lower cost credit instruments and also using automatic kinds of nudges, it's called in the business, to encourage consumers not to pay part of the monthly bill, but to pay it all to the extent they possibly can. And to, right now we have, for example, if you get a bill from the bank, you will get a notice saying in very fine print, if you don't pay this month's, if you do the minimum payment this month, it'll take you, what will it say, many, many years to pay off the debt. But it's lost in the paperwork. We need more effective things like that that would alert consumers to the fact that they are engaged in problematic activity and that if they don't change their practices, they will end up in serious difficulty. But right now, that one little piece of behavioral economics that's in billing is lost for most people. It's not noticeable.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Massé, la parole est...
Thank you very much. Mr. Massé, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just to follow up real quick, Mr. Jenkins, with regards to financial literacy, one thing I don't like is it just kind of puts us like, well, if Canadians and consumers weren't so stupid, they really could do better. I mean, that just kind of really plays into that. But we have a whole system that's baked in from even training our kids to go to banking by setting up accounts and a whole series of things. So I guess my question to you would be, do you have an opinion as to how inefficient our economy is because of the value we get out of banking in general? I mean, if you look at a $30 a month account just to do basic transfers, I think that's a drag on our actual economy overall, outside of even just being inefficient for consumers and the small and medium-sized businesses and so forth, is that would seem to me as a significant drag on our economy. So we should be actually improving our financial capabilities and productivity. They often comment on how workers aren't productive, but I really think our financial sectors are really significantly underperforming to the value that they're actually contributing.
Well, we haven't done any detailed econometric studies. We're not a large enough organization to afford that kind of thing. Personally, I'm not aware of in-depth studies on the relative efficiency drags of the structure and nature of our basic payment systems or banking systems. So it's hard to make a judgment call on that.
Okay, so maybe I'll move to Mr. Abudaya. If maybe you can perhaps count, so if you're looking at a basic bank account at $30 per month and you maximize that out through a year, how efficient is that in terms of productivity of the Canadian economy for a consumer to be spending $30 on basic transactions and most of it being electronic and you're never even stepping into a brick and mortar place? It's hard to believe that that's really a productive format.
Absolutely. Mr. Massey, I can talk at least comparatively. In many of the jurisdictions that we operate in and we look at, these fees do not exist. And once you observe a pattern, if one player is allowed to do it, many players start doing it, and then it becomes more and more okay. And you start to accept more of this, let's call it leaks in your financial pipeline flow from from an individual perspective or a business perspective. And there are more inefficiencies that come in there. So if you talk about wire transfers for businesses, once you cap the the maximum transfer amount in a certain system to, let's say, $2,000 a day. For a small business, sometimes you need to make $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. You have to resort to other forms of transfers, and then those carry fees with them. Wires at $10, $20, $25 each. All of these a mess, and I've not seen full reporting on what the aggregates are for all the Canadians, but I suspect this is a very, very large number.
Yeah, and you know what? It's kind of interesting because I can only just go through what I've experienced here as someone on the Hill that's been lobbied by financial institutions this matter. It seems to be, interesting that they often also have an entertainment industry for their executives and their board and a series of different things that are also tax deductibility as part of doing business, everything from golfing to sports tickets and so forth. Shouldn't we be looking at really, how those things are actually, relate to at the end of the day, they're paid to by fees. There seems to be a cultural thing here of acceptance that allows this quasi-entertainment industry that they get to enjoy by tax deductions as part of their systems that have been baked in for decade upon decade.
That I don't know enough to comment on. We operate a very lean company on our end, but definitely, as policymakers, as MPs in your spot, you can ask them, these questions. And scrutiny on these financials or guidelines in general and the tax system, what is included, what is not, this is definitely something that, we look to committees like yours to assist us Canadians in getting a better deal overall.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Chair, maybe we can ask our analysts maybe we can reach out to some of the banks that we've had here and get some specific numbers on their entertainment and their budgets related to that, and then what's tax deductible and what's not tax deductible. I'd be interested in that figure as we determine what's fair in terms of charging Canadian customers and how those fees relate to their entertainment expenses that seem to be, in my opinion anyways, rather gross. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the time.
Monsieur Padzer, la parole est à vous.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. Really appreciate what everybody's brought to the table. CanPay, I'm just wondering if you can just elaborate a little bit more here, because we're really seeing the lack of competition, true competition, when it comes to the online payment system per se, right? It seems like Interac is the one that it's their highway and they're the only one that drives on it, for lack of a better analogy here. So how do we get more competition in? I mean, we see the big banks are the ones who are basically on the board of Interac, so of course they don't want your company to come in and be another option. So can you just talk a little bit more about what that would look like to try to get either another highway built for companies like you, or maybe just even another vehicle on the highway? Just can you just elaborate on that a little bit more?
Thank you very much, Mr. Patzer. Definitely, I mean, one of the easiest ways is to at least introduce more oversight by committees like yours to see what's actually happening on the boards of such companies in the process of observing what's happening, and that would open up the room for further analysis and recommendations. And one thing with Interac is they built this technology in a time where this solution was needed, and it solved a big problem for the Canadians. Naturally, in technology, things stall with time, and it grabs a lot. It becomes burdensome to manage these systems because they rely on old technology. So opening up the door for providers like us under the right regulations, and for us, we need to get properly regulated. We can bring modern technology that makes things much easier, which is the separate highway that you can speak of. And definitely on third, if we can look at what recently happened in the US and the implementation of open banking, because the highways, the technology, it's ubiquitous. There's availability for a lot of options out there. We, as Canadians, under the right regulations, can select what's best for us. Introducing legislation that opens up access to the consumer information and giving the consumer the power to share this account information with providers that are properly regulated like us. definitely opens up the door for more competition. And as we know, when competition enters, the consumer typically is the biggest beneficiary from these situations.
So as a consumer, what kind of potential savings would I be looking at here by opening up the competition in this regard? Like, do you have any figures for this committee on how much money an individual could save if there was more competition? And have you done that analysis?
We've done it more on an aggregate level, but we can transfer it down to the specific consumer. I mean, I can cite my own personal example, but on aggregates, just on the e-transfer fees, if it becomes free for all the Canadians, we project, and reduced fees for the businesses that use Interac, we project at least $1 billion in the first year to come back into the Canadian pockets. And if you add to it the fees that cost, for example, wire transfers, if you have larger cap, take, for example, in the UK, FPS enables businesses to move around up to £1 million within their systems versus the limits that we have in Interac. These wire fees at 10 to 20 per wire add up significantly. So you can at least double that number to go up to 2.5, and even more. There's a third venue that comes in, which is international money transfers. It's a bit of a trickier one, so it would take longer to explain. But if you look at the situation here in Canada, we have international companies, like Wise, that operate in Canada and offer like very competitive international money transfers. That also could double the total savings, for the consumers that way. So in short, in aggregate, it's about $1 billion annual for just transfer fees. And as this enables more growth, within 5 years, you can see this go up to $5 to $10 billion easily, given the total population of Canada.
Okay, that's a pretty big number, so I really appreciate that. Thank you. I guess we got about 30 seconds left here. Shortly, are there any specific regulations right now that are problematic for you that need to be changed, or what are you seeing there?
The core of open banking is what will simplify us to become more entrants and to be able to enter and start competing. And definitely once getting access to this account information as such, to the user account information, and giving the consumers this right will give us also the ability to start proposing more and better adjustments in order to offer the competitive solutions to the consumers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Mr. Turnbull, I'll just like to ask you a follow-up question, Mr. Aboudaya. You've mentioned in your opening remarks that you have some experience in blockchain. This committee has studied blockchain in the past. What role do you think this innovation can play in making it, cheaper for consumers to transact? And we see Tether is now the third largest buyer of U.S. Treasuries. PayPal has launched its own stable coins. So what do you think blockchain can play in this ecosystem?
Absolutely, Mr. Lighthound. And we've looked at the work that your committee has done. It's absolutely a great stepping stone for doing more. Everything that you mentioned is warranted. Blockchain offers a lot of efficiencies as it comes to the actual movement and settlement of transactions and maintaining overall data in the ledgers. In engineering school, we used to throw a joke that if you want to find super old code, you need to go look in the banks, because some banks maintain code that's written in COBOL. That was needed, that was warranted. At the time, this was the best solution. Now, something like blockchain, a lot of the prerequisites that you need to create a meaningful banking system come with the technology itself, and it's hosted on cheaper infrastructure, as well as the protections that are required to maintain against fraud and manipulation. So, and definitely in the cases for countries where immediate and fast and rapid change can carry some risks. A careful considered migration and adoption plan of blockchain technologies as modules into the bigger financial system definitely is the path forward to make us more competitive as a nation on the global scale. And to that point, if we observe what other countries have started experimenting in introducing this technology into their, whether it's like their sovereign systems or in very specific sectors as the need demands, is an excellent way to make us very competitive into the future. And just the last bit is transparency. Blockchain brings a lot of transparency. Like these ledgers are very transparent. So they also definitely help in situations where, opaqueness hurt the end consumer.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe I'll add one thing that we should definitely do is lift the uncertainty regarding stable coins, which is which makes no sense. There is no way you can see stable coins as a security. But in any event, thank you very much for your comments. I'll turn it over to MP Turnbull.
All right, thanks, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today for this important study. Mr. Jenkin, maybe I'll start with you. I want to ask about market dominance in the e-transfer space. Do you think that really market dominance, and I think that's what this is all about. It's about looking at competition in the current sort of landscape, and the sort of structure of the market that seems to be limiting some players that would disrupt that market and probably to the benefit of the consumers. It seems to me anyway, what we've been hearing is that some of the players, the smaller players in this space that are innovating and disrupting or trying to disrupt, are sort of being blocked. And so it seems like the concentration of power is pretty significant, so that market dominance is present. But from your perspective, Mr. Jenkin, what are the signs that really market dominance is the problem here? Can you give us some examples of that? Or
well, you don't have to be a Competition Bureau technocrat to look at the landscape and see that there isn't. It's a very. I wouldn't say it's obviously not monopolistic or duopolistic marketplace, but there are very few, very large integrated competitors, and we all know. And that ironically has been reinforced by technology at one level, because there are increasing economies to scale in electronic networks, and this has benefited the banks enormously in terms of being able to continue their dominant role. From what we've heard from consumers and what we know from the work we've done is that there's an enormous appetite for more innovative structures and payment mechanisms and financial instruments out there. People understand that what they're being offered is a very limited menu. The problem is, and this is a difficult thing to manage, when you're talking about moving your money around, you're necessarily somewhat conservative and cautious, right? And the lack of familiarity with many of these new technologies that the vast majority of consumers have is definitely an issue here too. The other is, frankly, and I hinted at this earlier, if we want consumers to be very confident and engage in new technologies, because we know, and new payment providers and new systems, because we know they can bring efficiencies and reduce costs for consumers, we also have to pay an equal amount of attention to the protection frameworks that are going to be in place. This is new territory, so there's two sets of issues here. What kind of new protections are necessary given the nature and change in the technologies involved and the procedures that will be changed as a consequence as well? What risks, therefore, have to be mitigated from the consumer point of view, and that's prudential as well as just, increasing the risks I may have of fraud. We also want all these new providers to be financially stable. But because the problem right now is that too much of what we have is too limited and too siloed. So we need an approach to consumer protection in this area that's integrated, holistic, and is flexible enough to address unanticipated problems in the future as the technology mutates. Because if we don't do that, we're at grave risk of A, deterring people to engage in new technologies. We don't have a robust protection regime in place that's forward-looking. But we also run the risk of, too many bad stories because the protections aren't there and we didn't do a good job of anticipating the risks from the consumer point of view. So there's no better way to kill innovation than to have a lot of damaged consumers playing in new mechanisms that they aren't properly protected in. So I guess I would really suggest that it's important not only to make sure these new firms and new technologies can enter the market and compete and have the right rules to encourage that, but at the same time have the right safety nets and protections in place for consumers so they can enthusiastically and confidently engage in these new methods of moving their money around and banking effectively.
That's very informative, and I appreciate those comments. I appreciate the whole response that you gave there, and I think it certainly sounds like your focus is on the consumer and providing that confidence to the consumer. Mr. Kalodenko, I hope I said that right. Could you respond to what Mr. Jenkins has said here? Do you sort of agree with that? And I'll go to the other witness as well to see. And I'm not trying to pit you against each other if you disagree. I think that's okay. This is a democracy. We're okay with that. I just kind of interested because I really think Mr. Jenkins made some really good points that I tend to find quite appealing in terms of the overall sentiments. Would you sort of support generally what he said? Is there anything that you would add on? Any critical remarks that you would like to make or considerations?
Thank you for that question. We are very pro-consumer. We've always stood up for the consumer and making sure that Canadians are much more financially successful and secure. And so we're very much aligned in how we approach it. I do agree with just about everything that was said. I do want to add, though, that in our view, where the current incumbents have made themselves very successfully entrenched is with the interchange fees. The interchange fees are set at such a level where consumers think that they're getting a benefit because they're getting all these air miles, these air points in return, and the air points lock them into these providers, and they keep spending money because they think they're earning points. At the end of the day, they're paying these huge interchange fees through these points that they think that they're earning. And so all of this technology kind of works together to entrench the consumer into an anti-competitive playing field. It becomes very, very difficult to put something competitive out there which competes with that, because just Canadians have been fed this idea that the more you spend, the more points you get to fly for free. Well, but there's nothing free. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I think I was taught that from a very young age, that there's nothing in life that comes for free. But I appreciate that very much. And to your point, that we have been enticed into thinking that there are these sort of added benefits and points onto spending money. Okay, so thank you for that. I want to go to Mr. Abu Daya for your comments and reactions to what Mr. Jenkins had said. Hopefully you were following along and could hear all of those great comments. Do you want to add anything on? And also, if you want to highlight any unfair practices that you've seen, I would love to hear that as well. Thanks.
Thank you. I resonate with my fellow witnesses. Definitely, protections need to be installed. But I like to think of protections as, you're carrying a bird in your hand. If you press too hard, you're going to squish the bird. The key problem that comes from accentuating protection or focusing on protection is, you end up waiting for too long because you're making sure you install everything right, and then you end up losing the opportunity. And as an example, a lot of delays and overhauls that are supposed to come into the system can be excused by saying, "Oh, we're still working on the final protections that come in there." But otherwise, no, I do resonate with both.
Merci beaucoup,
Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Turnbull. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, la parole est à vous.
Thank you, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. The floor is yours. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Jenkins, first question, I'll ask you to ask yes or no, please, so that we can proceed quickly. Some of the witnesses who appeared before us before told us that the sale of credit cards was promoted by financial institutions, while it did not necessarily meet the needs of the consumer. So despite the evaluation that's done of the needs of the consumer, the banks are pushing for purchasing credit cards when it doesn't meet the needs of that person. So do their sales techniques, the people have told us that the sales techniques are very aggressive and that it's easy to get credit with few controls. Is that what you have observed? Yes or no?
Well, I hate saying yes or no because everything's more difficult than just yes or no. But yes, we've heard the same issues about pressure tactics, not just for credit cards, but for a whole range of financial service products offered.
Qui ne correspondrait pas nécessairement aux besoins. C'est ça.
That wouldn't necessarily meet the needs. Okay.
Également par où
All
par.
right. Yes and no again. So small retailers can pass costs on to consumers. So the consumer is the one that has to support transaction fees, especially those who pay in cash or by debit card. Is that correct?
Cross subsidy going on.
Donc, finalement, c'est les consommateurs les plus faibles.
So finally, it's the weakest consumers, if I can use that expression, that are paying for the interchange rates and for the credit cards for the richest people. That's the result, essentially?
There's a lot of benefit that goes to wealthier consumers on these schemes that my colleague here just mentioned. And it's the lower income consumers who pay for it because they frequently don't have those kind of cards and they don't certainly get those benefits.
Maintenant, comment les institutions financières vont
So
justifier?
How can financial establishments justify their rates of 15%? Is this specific to Canada? So just explain it. You don't have to say just yes or no in this case.
Interest rates in other countries, but certainly the Canadian situation has been a long-lasting one. It predates the pandemic. It predates the 2008 financial crisis. It goes back decades, where the cost of credit from a credit card is usually one of the highest you get if you're a consumer for unsecured credit, short of payday lending or those other kinds of.
Maintenant, vous êtes bien familier, j'imagine, avec.
So now you're familiar, I imagine, with the Consumer Protection Act in Quebec.
Croyez-vous que ça pourrait
So do you believe that this could be an idea? So first of all, this current regulation in Canada, is it outdated? First of all, and is there a model that could be based on the Quebec a model based on the Quebec model? Could that be interesting? So there are duties imposed on merchants that take into account the ability of consumers to pay.
I'm familiar with the Quebec regime, but I'm not familiar enough to know knowing how effective the legislation has been in the field is hard to determine right now. We don't have good data on the impacts. Notionally, it seems like a good idea, but it's very difficult getting the industry, short of direct regulation, to adjust their rates to a more reasonable level. Banks, I think, regard credit cards as a very profitable and important part of their earning profile.
Combien de temps, Véro?
Yes. Ben, si vous voulez, vous avez encore un petit peu de temps, mais sinon ça.
You have a bit of time, but it's up to you to decide. You have about a minute left. 1 minute? Okay.
Long développement, mais
Well, now knowing what is your view on the arrival of new credit projects like buying now, pay later, those types of things?
We're very concerned about that. We're doing work on it right now. It seems like initially, from the consumer perspective, an attractive thing. You want to buy a big item, and you get this immediate credit where you can pay it off in 4, say, installments. It looks attractive, and you don't accumulate interest, but God help you if you miss a payment. So it seems almost like they're structured in many cases to encourage people to take on more debt than they should, and then default, and then end up charging very high penalty rates for not paying on time. So this is something that we are very concerned about because it seems to be growing very quickly. And it's not just the banks that are doing this kind of stuff, but a lot of retailers, Amazon, you'll see many, many offers of this kind of buy now, pay later kind of opportunity. It looks superficially like a good deal, but it's very easy to end up paying more than you think because you can't maintain the payment schedule right on time. If you fall in arrears, it can cost you significant sums of money.
Monsieur Massé, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Massey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Jenkins, one of the reasons I asked for this study was because there was also really a participatory part of this Parliament and the government to shift consumer purchasing during the pandemic. We went to more credit cards and other types of purchasing power. We've seen online purchasing increase and so forth. So there hasn't been much of a regulatory response, or there hasn't been, kind of an acknowledgement that we've shifted consumer spending to different types of things. And what I want to be specific about is, more people are purchasing on credit cards, groceries, and common items that would be more associated and historically related to cash. And so do you have any comments about kind of, consumer spending going to items that are more predominantly historically linked to immediate needs and the welfare of a family to, now a borrowing practice that has upwards of 20 to 30% interest rate on it and other types of fees associated that wouldn't otherwise be part of consumer debt because they used other types of payment being cash predominantly?
We raised this in some detail in the paper that we handed in to the committee. We are very concerned about these trends where traditionally consumers understood, like, the things you buy on credit cards are normally, less frequent purchases, larger sums and so forth, stuff you save up for to some extent as well. And now what's happening is that instruments that were designed for that kind of market are now being used to buy groceries. Traditionally people, if they used an electronic transfer for groceries, they'd use a debit card and it would come out of their bank right away, and there were no potential of accumulating a debt. Now we're moving into a situation where we've got a raft of instruments consumers are using for very different reasons than they did, say, 15 years ago. And that's why we say that it's very important at this stage of the game that we need a reassessment of the protection regimes we have in place, and to some extent, I think as well, a re-education of consumers about the debt implications that they fall foul of when they use things like credit cards for everyday expenditures and get pushed. I mean, we've seen it in the last couple of years with the pandemic. The big impact has been on very stretched household budgets for very, essential things, food, energy, shelter costs, and so forth. And the temptation, because it's now become ubiquitous, to use credit instruments like cards that shift those daily expenditures into what would be effectively debt accumulation is very, that's one of the things we have to face up to now. We're in a different world than we were even 5 years ago.
And that's kind of where I also look at productivity, from the creation of, a tomato that goes all the way from the production, transportation, and distribution, and then the value of our financial markets just to move electronically some money around to purchase that seems rather inefficient and a rather large expenditure, especially if it consumes also personal debt beyond the original price. That's inefficient for our economy, for competition. I haven't brought in Mr. Kolodenko. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. A real quick question before I run out of time. I know that Questrade had to do extensive marketing with regards to your product line in the mass media. At least I've noticed that anyways. Can you maybe highlight, was that specifically because of the difficulty of entering the Canadian market as a competitor to some of the traditional trading that was there, and what was required for you to make that type of a breakthrough and is that perhaps a model that maybe squeezes some of the other Canadian alternative financial elements? We just Mr. Abudaya here can't even use his product in Canada, which is absurd. But what about the ones that can but still require extensive commitments of their budgets just to be able to be heard?
We're Canadian founded, Canadian owned, Canadian operated. We're headquartered here in Toronto or in Ontario. And, it took some time for us to get up and going, to be able to make our way into the financial services landscape. It's not easy competing against the largest some of the largest financial institutions in the world. Certainly, Canada is, as everyone knows, an oligopoly. And so in order to be heard, you're absolutely right. We had to make ourselves heard, and we did launch a mass advertising campaign. And thankfully today, the Questrade brand is much well known. But we had to work our way up to that. We had to become profitable and stay profitable and operate profitably and accumulate the budget necessary in order to do that. It's not a inexpensive endeavor, as you could imagine.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Massé. Monsieur Généreux.
Thank you, Mr. Généreux. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. A very interesting discussion today. Mr. Kolodenko, I want to consider on the same line of questioning. Now, I understand that Questrade does transactions. I like concrete examples. So I have $200,000 in RSPs. So it's just imagine that. So I take that money, I send it to you, and it costs me, let's say, it currently costs me several $100s in management fees currently. So I take that money, I bring it to you. How much will it cost me to manage that same $200,000? I imagine it's per transaction. I understand that in your company, we're the ones who have to do the transactions. We have to decide whether we want to buy one share or a fund. So based on what you said in your opening statement, the money that we're not paying in fees, we put it in our savings, which makes our savings increase. So explain to me how I can save money if I put my money in your company.
For the question, I very much appreciate it. So we pride ourselves on going direct to the consumer and providing the best value for the service that we have. Compared to other incumbent products, our fees are much lower. And so the fees that you actually save, the increment, the difference between you will be paying at a regular mutual fund, and the mutual fund fees are not transparent, just like I was mentioning earlier, the interchange fees. Mutual fund fees are on the back end, paid, collected by the financial institution that issues that mutual fund. Those mutual fund fees are some of the highest in the world, up to 2.5%. Our fees are, so at our company, you're right, you can either do it yourself, you can invest in it in a financial product yourself, in a stock or in ETF, which is kind of like a mutual fund. Or we have another product where we can manage your money for you and charge you a much smaller fee to do that as you would compared to a full-service provider. And so the difference in the savings would be something you can reinvest back into your RSP, and that would grow, as we say, up to, could be 50% more.
Okay. So to come back to what Mr. Jenkins mentioned a moment ago, the risk for the consumer, depending on the level of risk that people are ready to take. I mean, as soon as you start managing your own mutual funds, I saw on your website that you have some sort of robot or AI robot advisor. I don't know how to call it really, that allows people to be able to get advice on how to invest their funds. There's always a risk involved in the sense that people, as soon as they see a potential for their savings to grow and bring more profit, there's a potential of making wrong choices. Now, is your robot using artificial intelligence to assist people? How does it work?
artificial intelligence as of yet. Not to say that as the technology improves, we won't into the future. As of now, the portfolios are professionally managed, and there are different risk guidelines depending on what your risk tolerance is. We go through a questionnaire where we ask consumers, we ask Canadians, what is their level of risk tolerance? So we'll ask them what their time horizon is, how many dependents they have, what their income is, how long do they want to keep the investment for. And depending on some of the answers, we have an algorithm in the back that says you're either very low risk or medium or higher risk tolerance, and we'll craft a portfolio that is appropriate for that circumstance.
Monsieur Aboudaya,
Mr. Budaya, how is it possible that you cannot do business in Canada? What are the main obstacles?
As I mentioned earlier to the team, the key obstacle is being able to meaningfully move money from account to account. A lot of the fintech providers in Canada, if you've been subscribed to a few, you see a number on the screen, and then this number on the screen is the money that you have. If you want it to actually land in your account, there is a certain amount of delay depending on the size that you want to move and such. So for a meaningful settlement system or a meaningful payment network, the ability for the consumer to have faith in the service that you deliver frequently relies on your ability to land this money in their bank accounts, and this is only possible through Interac.
You mentioned earlier that there are many countries where it is now possible because you're doing business elsewhere across the world. So what can we do in Canada to be able to allow more competition between several players that could eventually enter the market? We know that crypto coin currency and other opportunities are needed in order to be more competitive. How can we allow the consumer to be able to make savings as a result of this competition and also save on some of these banking costs?
100%. I mean, the main theme was competition and enabling competition. What's inhibiting a competitive solution like ours from entering is the ability to access the consumer information. So definitely open banking is one of the elements. The adoption, and as I want to note definitely a note from Mr. Jenkins earlier around putting the right safeguards and encouraging the consumers with the right way to increase their adoption of cryptocurrencies. As a country, we start understanding better how we want this to be part of our financial ecosystem. That definitely helps. And the stablecoin point that we discussed with Mr. Lightbound, regulating the adoption of stablecoins and bringing it forward into the country. There was a paper that was presented to Indu that I read earlier. I think it was on November 11th. Around making federal regulations as it comes to the adoption of cryptocurrencies are important. And finally, what you are doing today is helping regardless, because you are inspecting where there are inefficiencies and where there potentially competition is not able to enter. And this definitely is one of the steps that will move things forward.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Généreux.
Thank you, Mr. Généreux. And now, Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Chair. To Mr. Kolodenko, with respect to access and interoperability, do you believe that there are barriers to entry or limitations imposed by major payment service providers that restrict fair competition in the e-transfer market?
I do. The fee schedule that is not transparent is tilted heavily in favor of the incumbents. Just because of the amount of transactions that they do, it's much cheaper for them to do it. And so fees often drive innovation or lack of, and they drive the strategy an innovator can actually take, because it's very difficult to innovate when you can't compete on cost. You can't compete on cost, it's almost impossible to drive anything new. Access is another issue, but I think we have to figure out how to force real-time rail faster. Real-time rail will actually bring innovation into this space, assuming that it gives better access to others. Payments Canada is another area that has to be looked at and talked about. But certainly, real-time rail and consumer-led banking, that together with a system to monitor and review fraud, has to be all integrated on top.
Thank you. With respect to fee structures, are there industry practices around fee setting or transaction costs that you believe may undermine competition or consumer choice?
Certainly. We talked about how consumers are entrenched with their air miles with those points. We talked about interchange fees, how those fees are very high, and that feeds back into the whole point system, and that limits the ability to innovate and to compete fairly. And also on the Interact, it's a different system. The Interact system is a different system, but access into that system and those fees are not transparent as well.
And with respect to innovation and market dynamics, how does Questrade view its role, your role, in fostering innovation in the e-transfer space while ensuring compliance with competition laws?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. In the immediate future, our role is to keep driving transparency for the benefit of Canadians and consumers, to drive those fees down. That's what we've been doing for the last 25 years at Questrade Financial Group. And the other part of that is we need to make sure that we get these real-time rails up and going. We've been talking about it for a long time, and the fact that you can't press a button, move money from a business or a consumer to another, and see that in real time is a big drag on the economy. It's a drag on our productivity. It's a drag for businesses because they're not sure when they're going to be able to access the money, when they're going to be able to make whatever other payments that they have to make their payrolls. This is all a drag, and in part to an earlier question is maybe perhaps why we're paying these $30 account fees. If we made things easy that are available through the internet and through the phone instantly, that would drive the prices down, benefit businesses and consumers.
Thank you, Mr. Kolodenko. Over to Mr. Abudaya. Question with respect to access and fair competition to you, Mr. Abudaya. Are there challenges or barriers imposed by major financial institutions or service providers that hinder smaller software companies from competing in the e-transfer market?
100%. Simply just the ability to access the consumer information. The only effective path that's available today is through Interact, and I definitely resonate with Mr. Kolodenko around the Payments Canada and the RTR, which was expected to come out earlier, and it's still no clear path of when this is going to come forward. This definitely prevents companies that want to put forward meaningful financial solutions from operating.
Questions that I find very important, and I go back to interoperability and innovation, and one with respect to fee structures and transparency. Are there limitations around interoperability or restrictive agreements that affect CanPay's ability to innovate or expand its offerings? And lastly, do you believe the current fee structures or practices for e-transfers could be viewed as anti-competitive or disadvantaged to smaller players and consumers?
100%. I'll answer the interoperability bit first. The way the system is set up right now, you have to go through Interact. So, and then when you go through there, they are very particular of what you can use, when you can use it, how you can use it, even if it is inefficient and does not yield the result that you need in order to deliver the promise that you have for consumers, which makes you successful elsewhere. So this, as I mentioned in my note, the forcing of the technology itself is limiting, is extremely limiting. And the technology in of itself, the access that the APIs grant you are not at par with what's available elsewhere in the world. And this is where innovation is required in the system itself, if not offering something, a replacement or a parallel rail in that sense. On the fees, absolutely, the fees are opaque. And then the fee structures are opaque. We know from talking to business owners, but nothing, present public, that the fees that they pay are not the same as what larger institutions pay, and definitely even as Mr. Koldenko mentioned earlier, this hinders even somebody wants to enter. If they don't know what's the cost that somebody else is paying, how do they know if they are as competitive as somebody else, and whether they can bring forward something that's more competitive? Absolutely yes on both questions.
Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Badaway. Monsieur Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Mr. Perkins.
That we need to get real-time rail going. We've had a lot of chat about that. I think Interac has gone through a couple of presidents on this. From your insight, why is it that the banks are so reluctant to do this?
Great question. I think that they've got very old technology that they've put together by Band-Aids and duct tape over years and years and years, for mainframe technology going back to the 1960s. They've invested billions of dollars. They keep investing, I don't know how much money, probably billions of dollars annually into maintaining it. And to rewrite it and to redo it is very costly. And so therefore they'd rather not, but that obviously hinders innovation.
Have quite a big profit margin, so I don't imagine that would be too much trouble for them to find the money. I will turn over to MP Rempel-Garner in just a moment, but one more question for Kempe. The government uses security. I shouldn't say the government. Banks use security, access to the system, safety. Mr. Van Bynen raised the good question on the issue of security and new entrants. We seem to see a lot of that excuse used in Canada to prevent alternative service providers. Are alternative service providers a security risk in other countries?
I'll point to the easiest way to put forward. I mean, always security is always a risk, but if you analyze where security breaches have happened, they are rarely actual system breaches. They are more frequently behavioral, and this is where Mr. Jenkins pointed out the point very specifically. Very simply, we open up ChatGPT or Google and ask about has there been any security breaches for FPS, UPI, and you're talking about systems that have tens of millions of users, and the answer is no. In the security, especially in the financial space, is well documented. As long as everybody abides by the normal regulations that come forward, that would not be the number one concern for innovation. I'm not saying let the innovators run free. Absolutely not. This is why we have bodies in the government that regulate how can the systems operate. But yeah, it's not to the extent that the banks put forward.